Hey guys, this is Miko. I'm back with another video today. I'm going to be talking about the Blunderbuss and every build possibility and what I would consider to be best in slot for those and when it comes to PvP and what role that build fits in a war roster. Blunderbuss, I think, is still very popular, is maybe getting slightly less popular than it used to be with the rise of Greatsword, as the Greatsword can do things that the Blunderbuss can do, but sometimes a little bit better, and sometimes a little bit differently, and it just kind of depends a little bit. But it is still by far one of the best weapons in the game. It can be used across multiple roles and multiple ways to get lots of value, and allows you to contest people very, very easily without putting yourself at any risk due to last chance. So, yeah, without further ado, I'm going to be going into. At first, I'm going to do like some in game tips, I guess, with the Blunderbuss, and then I'll go into like build guides. So, generally, when you're running the Blunderbuss, I don't think there is a single way that people run it now, unless you're using the exploit where you go unload. Usually, people will just go double down with every single build, just because it is better than unload at this point, and there are not many builds where Claw Shot is run. I think Claw Shot has the option to be run in light, and if you're going with that route, then Unload is good. But generally, when people are running Blunderbuss, they are always going Nut Shot, Azoth, and Splitting Grenade. I might be the only person that runs Blast Shot. There are a couple people that I know that run Blast Shot, but if you are considering Blast Shot, it's usually in a heavy build. There's not builds for other builds where blast shot's really considered. The reason why you run blast shot is if you think you can live either without the net shot and you want to just do more damage to a clump. So if it's super super clumpy, blast shot is pretty good. Or if you don't have any damage and Azoth isn't really worth running, then blast shot can be good just for the util of blast shot, which is how I run it in heavy. But I've also played this build in like Blunderbuss and Light a lot, and I played it in Medium a lot, so I think I'm have fair points when it comes to Blunderbuss itself. Main things that you need to be thinking about when you're playing for Blunderbuss is if you're playing it in Medium or Light, you generally are playing for ramp, which means that you're trying to stay on the Blunderbuss, and that will give you a damage boost, but you have to shoot these shots very, very quickly, or else the ramp will go away. This could stack up to 16% and is very significant. And then also deep load is something that can be slightly played for, but it's more of a passive thing. But everything else you don't really want to worry about. It's mostly you're looking at ramp and you're trying to save nut shot as a defensive to get out, and you're using Azoth with a normal shot into Azoth into a normal shot to nuke most people, and sometimes he will also dump a grenade on top of that. Generally, grenades are best used either as a peel thing for your teammates, or they're used as a way to nuke people who don't have stamina. Uh, there's not much of it in between. Otherwise, you don't really want to use grenades in light or medium, which we're going to be talking about light first, as a single target like thing. It's mostly like a nuke the clump thing, but in heavy, sometimes you end up using like splitting grenade as like a nuker. There's definitely times where you break that rule, but it's generally best just to throw the plague splitting grenades in the clump along on top of your melees and hope that turns into a kill. So this, I do not, full disclaimer, I do not have an active light setup, but I will kind of demonstrate how you would run it in light. Uh, I think light is probably the weakest way to run Blunderbuss right now. The main reason that you would go to light over medium is either that you want to pad the clump more, which is like a mortar build, which has not been viable for a significant period of time, or if you're in a kill squad that is heavily rotating into their backline and you need to keep up with them. In both cases, light is viable. Light is better at doing damage, obviously, but you will die quicker. But with Blunderbuss being so tanky passively, you tend to not die very fast. So it's more of a preference thing between medium and light, but they are played fairly similarly. Both these roles are either light is more of a you go into their backline sort of role, and you're like a backline harasser. This is generally outclassed by Greatsword at this point, but it is still viable. Greatsword just has more maneuverability, so it tends to do a little bit better in that role. The main spot that you see Blunderbuss being played is more of a holding space kind of passive role. There are other roles that do that very well. The EU like bow hatchet build also does that very well and has a little bit more range, but has a little bit less burst at times. It doesn't have the threat of one-shot potential and clumps as easily. It's more single target. And then you also have the Greatsword hatchet build, which is pretty good in like all around at holding space, but it doesn't have as much pressure because you don't have ranged. But the Blunderbuss main drawback is the range, so if you are playing versus a lot of Blunderbuss and you play spread out, Blunderbuss tends to struggle, and that's a spot where bow can be better than the Blunderbuss. But in terms of like stam management in light, you're running this in hardy, so you can get 3 rolls. You're mostly staying on top of the Blunderbuss, and you're kind of doing the standard thing where you never want to be in melee range, but you want to be just outside of melee range. And then it's just kind of basic combos, like you have your shoot, Aloft shoot, and then you have your shoot net shoot. And then there's times where you'll get 3 ammo, and that 3 ammo is coming from the extended chamber perk that people normally run. I personally tend to run bite back because I find this 3-shot thing kind of messing up muscle memory, and I don't like it as much. But it is a good perk to run, and you can get value out of either, whichever is kind of a preference thing. You generally don't aim for the head though, so the headshot perk won't really give you that much CDR. You just mostly take it so you can get the ultimate, which is a pretty good ultimate. But in terms of what you should be using ability for, net should be almost always used defensively. There are times where you can, if you've practiced with BB, where you could use net for the exhaustive net shot perk if you take that on armor, or you just kind of slow people and then you take advantage of that. It's mostly a technique that's used in heavy. If you use it in light and medium, the slow is only 3 seconds, so it's not very significant. Exhaustive net shot, if you time it right, can be very significant, but you have to time it right when they don't have stam. Otherwise, you're kind of just wasting your cooldown. You're making yourself more vulnerable. The more refreshing you have, the less punishing that is. You don't need to run refreshing with this build. I think if you are padding more and you're playing to do more damage, and then you're using that damage to like farm ultimates and do stuff with that, then you generally want to run refreshing, which is how I'll get transition into this light build guide. So generally you want to run more refreshing if you're in light. Exhaustive net shot I'd say is optional. Each want 2 to 3 piece Elia version, 2 to 3 piece freedom. 2 to 3 piece freedom just gets you out of combo range from great axes for most of the combos, but there's some combos that it does not. Elia version is just good because you'll be getting pressured out a lot and when people realize that you're in light. And you run nades on armor in light and you go for a max damage weapon. If you don't have the max damage like weapon with Flame Attunement keenly empowered and enchanted, then Flame Attunement keenly empowered is probably the second best. And then after that would be Flame Attunement enchanted. Keenly empowered, if you play for it, tends to be more damage than enchanted, and if you time your nades with it, it can be very, very good. In light, usually people run some sort of combination of health, stam, slash, and if you can't get that ring, then you're going health, stam, or you're just going champions ring at that point. Health, stam, empower, shirking, and power. You don't tend to have shirking procs, which is why I don't recommend it in light, but you can run it that way. Stam tends to be very, very good in light, and it tends to be very good in medium, but in heavy, I think it's more debatable. You are generally stacking fire damage with this build, and then you're looking for either keen or fire damage on ring. It's really debatable whichever one you use. The argument for keen is it will make your keenly empowered proc faster, which will in turn lead to more consistent damage from that. The argument to fire damage is you have 6 shots on BB, you have a 2% chance to crit, but every single shot, due to the passive that exists in New World, where if a shot does not crit, you have your next shot has a 5% increased chance to crit. It basically means that you have a much higher chance to crit than you would think. So you don't really need the keen, and the fire damage just adds more damage on top of that. I've seen arguments both ways. I think you're kind of fine going with either. It's a preference thing. I personally prefer the fire damage, but I can see the argument for keen. On the earring, you generally want refreshing and refreshing toast. The third perk is less important, and stat split on this is 200 strength, 150 int, 165 con, and there's no debate to that in light unless you're running a mortar build. And if you're running a mortar build, which if you are running out, you have to be. It's like kind of a judgy situation how much con you can get to. When I used to run it, I'd run it at 5 to 50 con, but if I was actually getting pressured, I would have upped that to 150 probably. So and then the rest, those points should be put uh, into int with the mortar build. But if you're playing for the actual like the abilities scale better or basically just as well off of int as strength, so it makes more sense I think if you're playing a mortar build to go heavy into int and then have a little bit of strength. Like you want to try to get to 300 int, because then you'll do more damage with the mortar and about the same as you would with strength. But then you sacrifice your con. So the major thresholds that you're looking to hit if you're playing a mortar build, which is not very common, is you're trying to hit. I mean, none of these strength perks really matter until you get to 200. So you can just dump whatever extra you have into strength, but if you get to 300 int, then that will be significant, and this will outpace damage from strength just a little bit, and then you can go an int-based gem. Usually you would run a tier 2 gem if you're doing a mortar build because it's actually higher damage than than a rune glass gem. So that's what I'd have to say for light. I wouldn't say light is very popular, but that's how you would run it. You also can run it like with a warhammer and play for more of a nuki build. That is still a 200 strength, 150 int rest con build, or sometimes people will drop the 150 int and they'll play for their melee weapon more and they'll just dump everything into strength. I think both those are fine. But 150 int tends to play for the blunderbuss more, and if you do more strength, then you're playing for your other weapon more, and your blunderbuss is more of a secondary. So you have to realize if you want to play as a blunderbuss as a primary or secondary, and it's usually better as a primary than a secondary. Going into medium, so this is my medium setup. I believe I just have the wrong ring on, which I have this ring, and this is about what you would want. So the main advantage of medium is it holds space better. You could take more hits, and then you just won't die from it, like things hitting you. So you're able to like kind of zone better, but you're able to chase worse, which means this is a zone control build in a war, meaning you are trying to stake out a spot where your healers could play, and you will kill anyone that comes into that zone. Bow hatchet tends to be about the same, like in terms of pressuring and survivability. Blunderbuss can burst people a little bit harder than bow hatchet. It just kind of depends on like what your role and if bows could actually hold that space as well. I think meta is starting to switch more towards bows because it's starting to get a little bit more spread out, but Blunderbuss tends to be better at nuking clumps and bow tends to be better versus single target pressure. So you usually want ignited gems in all of these, so this is an extra 10% damage. You do this as well in light, and then you want a fire damage or keen ring, and then the rest is basically the same as light, except you want you want Champion's Amulet here, which I do not have on this character, which will give you the Shirking Empower. I was literally running this amulet for a while just to get the Shirking Empower off because it's really important as medium, and you tend to proc it a lot more as medium. And on your gear, you generally want either refreshing perks, or you want like perks as in weapon perks, or you want Shirking Fortify. Shirking Fortify tends to be better in medium because you tend to dodge more, and you use dodges more as to actually dodge attacks, versus in light people use dodges to position more. And every single one of these builds too, I kind of glossing over this, but just use vines or stone form. Vines tends to be better with blunderbuss in my experience because you tend to farm ult very fast with this build, with all these builds, and the vines tends to get value. If you're playing mortar, that might be the one build in the game where you actually just still want to go the bile, even though it's bugged. Just because biles tends to be very good with mortar build because you'll charge ult very fast, and then you could actually have your ult do something, and then you start padding less because you're actually killing people with stuff. But in medium, usually you go 5 or Zill, you put shirking, or you put nades on armor, not on weapon, so that you could prioritize damage on weapon because you're playing no control space. You max out your shirking fort, and then you look for refreshing or freedom. If you're in EU, you're looking for freedom. If you're in NA, you're looking for refreshing. I think refreshing is generally better with this build, but you could see an argument for freedom. Generally, freedom will help you versus one-shot-ish combos which don't exist as much on top of point or near the edge of point. It's mostly just dealing with like bows. I could even see the argument for going Eleversion in medium if you really want to, and just drop into freedom and running like stone form as a compensation for that, since you could pox stone form while you're staggered. But that's a little bit of preference. The shrinking power is the main thing you're looking for here, and you're looking for the same BB, except you could take exhaustive net shot if you really want to slow people down and prevent them from entering your backline. Like a great sword that gets hit by exhaustive net shot actually just can't play the game half the time. But you will also not be able to, in this build, to get to the final perk in the tree, the apparatus, which is the main thing that prevents people from going in your backline, which is something that you tend to get in heavy. If you really wanted to get this apparatus, then you would need to find a way to get blast shot, in which case you usually are cutting net shot in medium, so it's not worth it. So net shot in this build is also used as a defensive very often, as well in light. Heavy breaks that rule a little bit. This is what I currently run for heavy. This is the setup I run in most, but I have run medium with success in wars as well. And light, I think, is less common now than it used to be. Heavy, I think there's like a couple ways to run this. I still think the blast shot way, when kind of playing it as like a debuff bot, is like the best way to run it heavy with this build. There is an argument to do something very, very similar to what you would do before, where you would take something like literally what you run in the medium build. You could run this in heavy, and it would not have any problems. You would do a little bit more damage, but I'd argue that in heavy your damage is already so low that it doesn't make a lot of sense to run this. But if you're running like a 200 con heavy build, then it makes sense to run this. But I think the like 300 con like pure debuff bot in a heavy build tends to be better, but I could see the argument for running something like this. I think both builds are fine. The main advantage that you get out of heavy versus medium is in medium you have to dodge almost every attack, because then you'll take too much damage. In heavy you can soak up normal attacks, and so that you don't stam deplete yourself, and you can just dodge key abilities, which allows you to stay alive more. If you try to dodge every ability in heavy, you will find yourself getting stam more often and still dying like you would in medium. But if you accept that you're in heavy and you just take half the damage that you would normally, and you just eat the melee swings, and you put more slash ward in, then you tend to do better because you can dodge all the key abilities and live longer that way. Generally, in heavy, you are also not running ramp. So if you're not running ramp, another thing that is really good with the Blunderbuss, let me get rid of these shots real quick, is that you can do a double shot, and then you can go to your secondary, and then you can like cast an ability or two, and you come back, and you just have your ammo back, because you don't have to play for this ramp. So it feels a lot more smooth. And like you could basically do like 2 autos with any weapon and come back. You might even be able to do 1 auto, I'm pretty sure you can, yeah. So you can be like, you can just kind of not do the reload animation and just have more damage that way. But you could really only play that way if you don't have ramp, because otherwise ramp is too important to play for. So, and heavy, the perk tree I normally run is this. The lingering flow I find to actually be decent value on point, because it helps people reposition a little bit. The blast shot itself has a 10% ren that gets applied, which tends to actually help people die. And then the reason why you go for apparatus and barb netting, apparatus is just one of the best slowing abilities in the game, and on top of double down, you can like basically make people hate you. So they literally just can't run away from you. And then barb netting just gets you more ult charge. Generally, when you're in heavy, in medium and light, you're playing for DPS. In heavy, you're playing for ult charge. How that changes things is generally you are running a plague splitting grenade on your blunderbuss. Like this is almost mandatory, and then you're running chain as a secondary instead of attunement. And then you're looking for either keenly jagged or plague crits, or maybe keenly fortified as a third perk. Keenly Jagged is best for ult charge. The argument for plate crits is you hit so often with Blunderbuss, because each individual pellet counts as a hit. Each one of those has a chance to crit, so you're more likely to crit, which means that if you really target people well with heavy, you can just put plate crits on them for free, and then they'll just die over time. In heavy, you're looking to max refreshing ward as much as possible, which if you get shot by a blunderbuss when you have refreshing ward, then that's going to instantly proc all your refreshing ward stacks because each individual pellet counts as a hit. So it tends to be very, very good on point teams to have refreshing ward because it counters blunderbuss. And then you're either looking to max freedom or maybe shirking fort, but I'd argue freedom is a little bit better. The argument for shirking fort would be if you just dodge and attack every now and then you'll just have more fortified. The argument for freedom would be I'm in heavy, I'm not going to die anyway because I'm in heavy. So freedom will help me in those circumstances where I would die even if I had the fortify from shirking fort. So I tend to have to live better with freedom than shirking fort personally, but I know other people that feel the other way. Amulet in this, you almost always want health slash, and then this is the one option that you have with other things that's not available, is you could get a purify. The argument for purify, uh, with this is you generally don't stam yourself with heavy because you just soak more damage. And when you get hit below half HP, then your uh last chance perk, I believe it's called, yeah, last chance tends to proc, which gives you 50% fortify. So then you have purify proc on top of that. You pop a health pot and you're back to full HP without any problems, and you have 50% fortify, so you just won't die. And you tend to not get set below 50% HP in heavy very often if you're playing correctly. Which in medium and light, you tend to go below 50% HP like fairly often. That stam recovery is more important for living. In heavy, it's not as necessary in my experience. But I could see the argument for going for stam recovery in heavy still. I think that's a rule that you could break though with this build in particular, but not really with many other builds in the game. So you can find some quote unquote BIS gear for like cheaper for this build. Generally, this is either run with a Ice Gauntlet or Void Gauntlet secondary. If you're running it with Ice Gauntlet, you're going Pylon. If you're running Void Gauntlet, then you are playing a standard Void Gauntlet tree. Pylon is definitely more popular. I think the Void Gauntlet aspect is very, very good versus heavy clump meta. If it's more spread out, then Ice Gauntlet tends to be better. And yeah, so I mean, the only thing I didn't talk about here is like gems. So you tend to be more physical or slash oriented with your gem setup, no matter what in these builds, because melee are your main source of like pressure. So you want to ward against them, and the other forms of pressure aren't very significant or don't really exist on point. You can get away with 4-piece Resil and heavy, but it kind of depends. Great Axe has like a passive that increases their crit damage by 10%, so 5-piece Resil is ideal, but if you have 4-piece Resil, it's probably fine. Refreshing Ward and Freedom are your priorities for gear. And yeah, so heavy is just a purely deady point roll for the most part. If you run it with Void Gauntlet, you can kind of break that rule and play it in like a normal group if you really know what you're doing, but generally not advised. This is generally best as a point roll, but if you do play it in a normal group, the nice part about being in heavy is you are able to commit to the point at a certain point, so you can play like a normal player and then just be insane at the deady point game when the time comes around for you to get on. But yeah, that's everything to do with Blunderbuss. It's been a bit since I've done one of these guides, but the main thing with Blunderbuss is if you're playing with light and medium, if you don't have the BIS BB, you are literally missing out on 10 to 15% damage, which is very, very significant. And then if you're in heavy, you are literally just playing for an ult battery, and as light and medium, you're playing to either to pressure out and kill people, and you're just looking to frag. So that's going to be it for this guide. I'll see you guys in the next video.